Welcome everybody to GoLocal Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. A couple quick notes. First, want to thank John Wolf from San Miguel School. Good insights into how that inner city school for the poorest of the poor is helping them handle distance learning and keep them on a high level academic track. At 12 noon, we'll have Dr. Michael Fine, former head of the Department of Health. He'll be back on today with updates. Obviously, Pawtucket and Central Falls are hot spots, and data coming out of there showing some disturbing trends. 1 o'clock will be Governor Raimondo. She'll do her briefing again. She is not allowing reporters to ask direct questions or follow-ups, and that's an ongoing issue. Let's go to David Sirota from just about everywhere, a political consultant with the Bernie Sanders campaign, former journalist, big-time thinker, and has just launched a very interesting political blog called TMI, Too Much Information. David, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So, David, we've known each other a little bit. You did some very, very important journalism related to sort of the relationship between Wall Street and government, looked at the hedge fund influence, and touched on Rhode Island's issues, including Governor Raimondo's relationship to Wall Street. How did that prepare you? That was sort of in the middle of your political career. How did that prepare you for this last run?
Well, you know, I mean, I've been a journalist. I've been in politics. You know, the reporting that I did and the political work that I've done, I mean, they're not all that dissimilar in the sense that it's the same overall for me mission, which is to say that, you know, I work on underdog. I've worked on underdog campaigns. I've worked on campaigns that challenge the establishment. And my journalism is journalism that asks tough questions of the establishment and of, you know, the powers that be. So essentially, you know, a Bernie Sanders campaign, and you know, whether you were a voter for Bernie Sanders or not for Bernie Sanders, I think we can all agree that he was somebody who posed a threat to Wall Street, the financial industry, the powers that be. And so a lot of the themes that I had reported on for years were themes that he was talking about on the campaign trail. And so as a speechwriter for Bernie Sanders, that knowledge was you know, front and center for me in the work that I was doing on the campaign.
Listen, your role in the campaign was not only as a speechwriter, but also your daily blog and email outward was incredibly informative and sort of set the tone in some ways for the Sanders campaign. Sanders had tremendous momentum and really blew out the competitors early on. Coming out of Iowa and New Hampshire looked like this thing might actually happen. What went, to use the euphemism, what went wrong?
Well, look, let's first start by saying that what was achieved was incredible. If you would have said, you know, 5 years ago that a senator from Vermont who takes on the corporate and the economic establishment would be a serious candidate for president and would be one of the two remaining candidates in a multi-candidate race in 2020, you would have said that I can't believe that would be impossible. So that, I think, shows the success that we had. Also, I think we've won the ideological argument in the sense of that the center of the debate over policy, at least in the Democratic Party, if not in the country at large, is the center of what Bernie Sanders has been saying actually for two presidential runs at this point. So, you know, Medicare for all, you know, a Green New Deal, you know, a $15 minimum wage. I could go on, but these went from, oh, I can't even think about these kinds of issues to now issues that are considered mainstream in the Democratic Party, if not the country at large. Now, I think it's fair for you to ask, you know, what exactly went wrong on the campaign, because we ultimately didn't win. We didn't win, and the campaigns are designed to win. And you know, I think a lot of things were aligned against us. There were external forces. I mean, when you take on the corporate and economic establishment, they're going to throw everything they have at you. There were, you know, months of ads vilifying Bernie's central part of his platform, Medicare for all. The other candidates ganged up on that. You had the centrist candidates fall in line behind Joe Biden after South Carolina, which created an enormous wave. I think I read that there was something like $75 or $70 million of positive of media coverage for Joe Biden after that South Carolina win. The kind of media coverage, I should add, that we didn't get after we won Iowa, Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada. So there was a disparity in sort of momentum building media. And then I would argue that we didn't do as good a job as we needed to do to explicitly contrast with Joe Biden on a day-to-day basis, over many, many weeks and months. That Bernie Sanders at times contrasted with Joe Biden on major issues like Social Security, the Iraq War, the bankruptcy bill, unfair trade deals. And when he did it, it was extremely successful. But we didn't do it over many, many months. And so Joe Biden, in absence of that, was able to become seen by many voters as a kind of non-controversial, unity, electable candidate. And in other words, what I'm really saying is that we didn't have that kind of vigorous back and forth in the Democratic primary that most Democratic primaries of the past have been defined by.
David, politics is a winner-take-all. You get no points for finishing second. Secondly, you were very good at finding Joe Biden's track record. You know, I worked on the Hill in the late 1980s, and I remember Joe Biden. He was a centrist Democrat. He pushed for a number of things that now in the Democratic Party would be considered ultra-conservative, I think, in the norm today. You were good at finding those clips and presenting those clips, and you came under fire for just pointing out his record. That seems, listen, Donald Trump's no one's fool. He's going to pick apart, they're good at it. Republicans are good at it. They've been good at it at every cycle, at pulling apart people's records and driving it down Democrats' throats. What's the disconnect still in the Democratic Party to be able to play the game at that level and win?
Well, the primary, one of the narratives in the primary was that if the candidates go after each other too hard, it will endanger and weaken the eventual general election nominee. And of course, that has not proven to be the case in past elections. I mean, the primary between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton was a knockdown, drag-out affair, and Barack Obama ended up winning the presidency. And I would argue that tough primaries end up battle-testing candidates. It ends up forcing candidates to deal with their own records. It ends up having candidates practice how to respond to criticism of their record. It makes them stronger general election candidates. Now we're in a different scenario where I would argue we didn't have as vigorous a back and forth between the candidates, and now we have a nominee who is less well vetted, who hasn't really been significantly challenged on his record, hasn't really been battle tested before, going into an election against a pretty vicious opponent. And I think the people who were upset about the times that we brought up Joe Biden's record, you know, C-SPAN videos of Joe Biden talking about cutting Social Security. I mean, this is not, it's controversial on the substance, but it's not controversial, it shouldn't be, to bring it up. But there was this idea that because we brought it up, Donald Trump will now bring it up, as if Donald Trump and the Republicans didn't know about Joe Biden's record on the Iraq War or trade or anything else. I mean, that's just absurd. It's preposterous. The thing that I worry about as somebody who wants to see Donald Trump defeated is that Joe Biden hasn't really had to take a big punch. Metaphorically speaking, like he has not had to deal with a daily onslaught of why did you support, NAFTA, the China trade deal, TPP, that offshored our manufacturing capacity? Why did you support a bankruptcy bill to help your credit card donors? Why did you support that? A bill that will now potentially harm hundreds of thousands of Americans who are going to have to declare bankruptcy. He has not really had to publicly deal with a back and forth on that. He could have had to deal with that in a back and forth during the primary and at least practiced on it. And I should add, the party, had there been a vigorous debate about that, would have at least had a chance, party voters, to potentially choose someone else with those potential weaknesses on the mind. But, and again, that happened at some level when it came to Social Security in Iowa, for example. But it wasn't the overarching theme of the Democratic primary, and I think that hurt us.
Well, and it happened in Iowa, and Joe Biden didn't perform well in Iowa. Listen, the Republicans are good at this. They're good on attack. They're good on it. You go to Willie Horton on forward. Jennifer Lawless, the University of Virginia professor, was on yesterday, and I asked the question, where's Joe Biden? She said he's sitting in his basement looking at his computer. And you know, she's a Democratic leading political scientist, but here's the reality. Joe Biden is nowhere in any narrative. Is there a chance for him, other than Donald Trump running against Donald Trump, is there a pathway for Joe Biden to enter this race and become meaningful?
Well, I mean, look, I think the Democrats, in some ways, they're getting, the party leaders are getting what they want, which is Donald Trump at the center of things, people criticizing Donald Trump, the Democratic nominee not really campaigning on sort of a strong policy-based, substance-based message, and that basically not offending the party's big donors. Look, the party has a problem where it's got a divide between its big donors and its grassroots. So arguably what the party wants is a candidate who's a blank slate, who doesn't offend necessarily either side, doesn't illustrate the differences in agendas between the grassroots base of the party and the donors. That's what Joe Biden is effectively being right now. The problem is, as you allude to, is that there's a whole political swirl happening right now at one of the most critical moments in our country's history, and the Democratic nominee is nowhere to be found. So in my view, I don't think being outside of the battle, outside of the boxing ring, if you will, is necessarily a good strategy. I mean, there needs to be a leader of the Democratic Party making a strong, substantive, honest argument against Donald Trump for why a Democratic president would be handling this situation a lot better. You hear it sometimes, you hear it periodically, but as you allude to, it's not a consistent message. And what we've learned in American politics is, especially in the era of social media, in the era of 24/7 cable news, it's a very loud environment. If you are not constantly putting forward a drumbeat, then you are going to be lost in the noise.
Listen, Barack Obama had a huge advantage in running against Hillary Clinton and running for the presidency against John McCain. He had functionally very little record to be attacked. He had only been in the Senate a short period of time. Even as when he was the editor of the Harvard Law Review, he used his name very infrequently in penning opinion pieces for that publication. Joe Biden has a 40-year history between the United States Senate and being vice president. Listen, there's 1 million votes and 1 million bad votes, even if he was near perfect. He's going to have a hard time dealing with sort of Republican attack strategies.
I don't disagree, and he's going to need to have answers for everything that we've discussed. I mean, he really will have to have those answers. And look, we haven't seen all that effective answers from him, except to say that he has tried, in the primary at least, when this periodically came up, he tried to basically lie his way through it, which I don't think is going to work. I mean, there were various times in which he basically denied that he had anything to do with the record of Joe Biden. I mean, at one point he insisted that he didn't write or support the bankruptcy bill, which he literally wrote and helped the Republicans pass. So he has clearly settled on some sort of strategy of any inconvenient questions that come up. I'm just gonna lie. I'm just gonna lie straight through it. I don't think that's going to work, but I should put an asterisk there that Donald Trump banks on the same kind of calculation, where Donald Trump just pathologically lies through everything. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that Joe Biden lies as much or as pathologically as Donald Trump, but perhaps we're entering a cynical phase of our politics where Where it used to be, if an inconvenient fact came up, there was that thing called spin. You'd stipulate the facts and then you'd spin it your way. We're now into an era where a fact can be said. You voted for this bill. You supported this bill. This is not a disputable fact. And in fact, it then gets disputed, where the candidate or the president says, no, that's just not true. It's just categorically untrue. And as a journalist, I worry about the idea that basic facts are now in dispute. Like, we can't even stipulate a basic set of facts that we can all argue about what the facts mean or what should be done about them. We are now into an era where basic facts, the sky is blue, water is wet, you voted for this bill, those facts are actually challenged and disputed by the most cynical actors in our politics. So it is a real problem for a democracy when you need to have a basic set of facts for everybody to have their opinions around.
Listen, right now, Donald Trump drives the narrative. He has press conferences every day at 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock, right against the local and national news. He controls the discussion for the most part. He yings and yangs with governors. One day he's praising them, the next day he's chiding them. This is going to go on for a very long period of time, this health crisis and this economic crisis. How does Joe Biden emerge? How can he emerge to get back in the race from his basement?
Well, look, I think he first and foremost needs to be much more critical of specific decisions and specific actions that the president is taking or not taking. That he has to, he has this, I've heard him say something to the effect of, we're in a crisis, we have to get behind our president, even, set politics aside. I mean, that's just, I just don't think that's actually true. And actually, I don't think that's doing the country a service, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. I think we should be able to agree that democracy requires a vigorous discourse. One of the basic premises of our democracy is that we can argue it out. We can have a vigorous discourse, and a strongly vigorous discourse ends up producing, in theory, better policy. So I don't think this whole I have to go silent because it's a crisis and get behind the president idea is even good for democracy, and it's certainly not, I don't think, good politics. He has to be out there in specific ways about what Trump is doing wrong and how the Democrats and his administration, his future administration, would make different decisions. And I would also argue that he has to be willing to tell a story. And by that I mean it's not just that Trump is incompetent, and certainly there's plenty of that, but it's also that Trump and the response that Trump has put forward oftentimes serves the interests of the financial players and sponsors of the Republican Party that bankroll elections and buy our democracy. I mean, you can look at the bailout bill, right? I mean, just as one example. I mean, now granted, the bailout bill was supported by both parties. So, but just as one example, I mean, the bailout bill had a huge pot of money for the largest corporations in this country, and relatively small amounts of money for workers. That wasn't an accident. And I would argue that's not an economic theory either. That is a reflection of who the Donald Trump, who the Republican leaders, who the political system actually works for, which is large corporations who bankroll our politics. Joe Biden has to be willing to tell that part of the story too.
Let me just go back a little bit. Wall Street obviously is a major factor in political fundraising. But Bernie Sanders, I want to say in February, raised around $27 million, and Joe Biden raised peanuts, like $12 million. The Sanders campaign was brilliant in being able to tap into month over month small donors making small donations. Is that the pathway for the balancing of the influence of Wall Street versus Main Street?
I absolutely think so, but I think it probably can't be a balance. I mean, it is a way to be competitive in these elections, small dollar fundraising, if you can do it. And I should add, it's as you get down the ballot, it gets harder and harder to do because you're less and less famous. You have less and less of a platform, but it can be done. I say it probably can't be a one-to-one financial balance because there are things like super PACs, there are things like 501c4s, dark money groups that can just pour unlimited amounts of money into the process, where they don't have to abide by campaign contribution limits. They can just literally 3 executives can write checks for $500,000, and so I think when we compare what Bernie Sanders raised and spent versus what Joe Biden raised and spent, or what I would actually first say what the establishment candidates as a whole spent. I would say you have to take into account the super PAC spending. You have to take into account the issue spending against Medicare for all by the healthcare industry, which isn't technically classified as necessarily election spending, even though it's obviously shaping election outcomes. And I think when you actually count all of that money up, it's still not a balance. But the good news is that you can be competitive if you do grassroots fundraising correctly. You can be in the race, in the contest, in a way that perhaps 5, 10, 15 years ago you couldn't, because you just got drowned out completely.
David, your newsletter, TMI, Too Much Information, talk about the role that's going to play during the campaign season and into the future.
Yeah, well, I started this newsletter after the campaign because there's clearly a hunger out there for information about what's going on, and information that doesn't pay fealty to either party. And you can find it at sirota.substack.com, or you can just go to my website, davidsirota.com. It's right there. And what I hope to do is not just break some news, but also contextualize what's going on in the news in a way that perhaps the daily news cycle doesn't explain. We know a lot moment to moment about what exactly is going on in Congress, what is going on in the coronavirus emergency, for instance. What we don't have a lot of is the larger story of what's going on, the context for what's going on. As we discussed, one example, when a bill passes, it's not just people woke up one day and decided to pass a bill. Oftentimes, it is the bill is a product of competing financial interests among the political donors who bankroll campaigns. Those are the kinds of stories I want to tell. Those are the kind of reporting that I have done and that I will do.
Going forward, how does Joe Biden beat Donald Trump?
Look, I think in a certain sense, no matter what happens right now, assuming the economy doesn't just incredibly bounce back, assuming that we're in this new normal, I think any Democratic nominee probably, unless they totally blow it, probably starts this race with somewhere between 43 and 45% of the vote, just because Donald Trump is such a polarizing figure. Look, Joe Biden could blow it, and he could end up, being down in the 30s if he is some sort of horrible scandal. But in general, a generic Democratic nominee should start at about 43 to 45%. How do you get that final 5, 6, 7%? I would argue that what Joe Biden needs to do is be a different Joe Biden than he's been in the past. And what I mean by that is the Joe Biden of the past predicated his public brand on juxtaposing himself against the base of the Democratic Party. He was a politician who would say, he issued a press release on his website as one little example. I'm one of the most conservative Democrats in the Senate, right? Basically saying, look at me, I am not one of those progressives, one of those liberals, one of those people in the base of my party. I am a, quote, moderate, a centrist, et cetera, et cetera. I think if Joe Biden does that in this general election, it will weaken his ability to win the general election. I think this is a base election about motivating the base. I think Donald Trump has so polarized things that the base of the Democratic Party and its agenda is now seen as far less polarizing than perhaps it was fairly or unfairly in the past. That, for instance, the coronavirus crisis, it spotlights how, we need a national healthcare system. And it spotlights that in a way that makes it much harder to vilify and demonize that idea. So I think if Joe Biden goes into the general election saying, look, I'm not part of that base of the party, then he can get tarred as somebody who just represents essentially the corporate establishment, and Donald Trump can do his whole drain the swamp nonsense, which is laughable, but he can do that. if that's the situation that Joe Biden puts himself in. If Joe Biden chooses a different path where he says, look, I am not going to juxtapose myself against the base of the party. I am going to say I am a proud Democrat. I am part of the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party, if you will. I am somebody who can be the next FDR, and I'm going to embrace that bolder, serious agenda. Then I think he has a chance to motivate and energize the party in a way that brings out the kind of turnout that will be necessary to not just get to 45, but to get to 50 plus.
And can he do it in his DNA? Can he create a narrative that's going to make that Bernie Sanders donor a progressive thinker who's 28 years old, who may have just gotten laid off and can't even make the $10 a month donation anymore? Can Joe Biden reinvent himself to attract that voter and motivate them?
I mean, that's the question. I wish I had an answer. And that's that, as somebody who wants to see Donald Trump defeated, that's what keeps me up at night. Can Joe Biden actually evolve? Can he actually be a better candidate? And can the people around him ignore their own political reflexes built up over 10, 20, 30 years of triangulating politics to actually realize the moment that they are in? I don't know the answer to that. I am hopeful that he can get there. You've seen some noises made by their campaign, sort of reaching out to Bernie and the Bernie Sanders campaign. Certainly hasn't been enough. The question will be, ultimately, if they do what I'm talking about, they will get blowback from some of their big donors. And the question will be, where will they stand at that point? What will they choose at that point? And if they choose a sort of middle ground, I'm going to try to find some sort of middle ground here. I just think that's a disaster to look indecisive and to look like you're trying to side with the very establishment that Donald Trump, dishonestly, of course, but that Donald Trump wants to try to run against.
Who should Joe Biden select as his vice president?
I'm not going to get into the specific, beefsteak stuff. I mean, there's so many candidates out there. I mean, he said he's going to nominate a woman. There are so many good progressive women out there in leadership roles in the Democratic Party. I think the question will be, does he go with somebody who tries to appease and placate the establishment, or does he go with somebody who tries to say to the base of the party, I'm going to be an ally and my administration is going to be an ally? That's what I'm looking for.
The highest profile Democrat in the United States today is Andrew Cuomo. Did Joe Biden make a mistake by boxing himself in and saying, I'm going to nominate a woman? Is that reversible, or is he locked into that?
No, I presume that he meant what he said. And I think, look, Andrew Cuomo is getting a lot of media for, he's the governor of the capital of the media. I mean, I think we could go off on a whole discussion about that. I think one of the sad things about what's going on in our media and politics right now when it comes to that is that there are a number of governors who've performed, and I'm talking empirically speaking now, who've performed a lot better than Andrew Cuomo. I mean, Gavin Newsom, Jay Inslee is two examples. Just when you look at the data on what's gone on in those states, Washington State, California, versus what's gone on in New York, you say, and you look at the policies that those governors put in place, I mean, they've just done a much better job. Andrew Cuomo is somebody who, just because he's on television, because he happens to represent the media capital of the world, he is being portrayed as some hero, even though he's cut Medicaid in the middle of this crisis, even though New York has become the epicenter of the virus. And I'm not just saying that that's all his fault. I mean, the Medicaid cuts are all his fault, but the explosion of the virus in New York is not all his fault. But the point is that one thing that concerns me as a journalist is that the metrics by which we say somebody's doing a good job apparently has less to do with whether you're actually doing a good job and more to do with whether you can get your mug on TV. And that is a serious problem, because we need to evaluate whether our leaders are doing a good or bad job based on whether they are doing a good or bad job, not based on whether they are dominating the news cycle.
Absolutely true. Listen, Rhode Island's got the 6th highest number of cases per capita. It's got the 8th highest number of deaths per capita, and it's got 240,000 people out of work. Governor Raimondo's getting good reviews for her performance. She does briefings every day, and of course has not allowed the media to ask any questions or follow-ups directly. You have to wire them in, and then they decide which ones they're going to read on air.
Yeah, and look. Donald Trump is actually, I would argue, is the logical endpoint of this problem, which is that Donald Trump operates on an idea that the more he's on television, the more he is the center of attention, the better he will do, the more like a leader he will look, regardless of what the results actually are. Now, it's always sort of been like that. I mean, it's always, news cycles and news coverage are important, but we are now in a situation where I think our public officials realize this situation where if they're just on TV, it in some ways to many voters, or at least to the news environment we live in, it doesn't matter whether they're actually putting in place good policy. And so a democracy, I think, has a serious problem if how we evaluate leaders, how we choose leaders, how we reward or punish electorally our leaders is based on how much attention they're getting, not based on the actual results.
David Sirota should be the new Dos Equis man, the most interesting man in America. The author of TMI, Too Much Information, the newsletter. It's a must-read for everyone, Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, progressives. It can be signed up for at davidsirota.com. Thank you so much for taking all the time today. Hopefully we can have you back over the election cycle, and appreciate all your good journalism over the years as well. Thanks, David.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Everybody else, we'll have Dr. Fine at 12 noon, former director of the Department of Health. 1 o'clock will be Governor Raimondo's briefing. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in, and stay safe.